Okay. We're going to talk here for about 20-30 minutes about St. Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways of proving the existence of God. And we're going to talk about St. Anselm and his so-called ontological proof of the existence of God. As far as I know, Anselm's attempt to prove the existence of God is the first one in philosophical history. You've had arguments proving there were no God, but the proof of God seems to be unnecessary. And in fact, we might even ask ourselves why philosophers worry about the whole thing. That, in fact, is something you're supposed to be worrying about. I hope you are. But St. Anselm's argument is pretty clear. He wants to say that God is perfect. In fact, the most perfect thing that exists is God. Well, that begs the question, doesn't it? The most perfect being is God. And he asks, what would be more perfect? A being that exists or a being that doesn't exist? And he concludes that a being that does exist is more perfect than one that doesn't. And so God must exist, because as the most perfect being, if a more perfect being would be one that did exist, not simply one that I thought up, then he'd have to exist. Problems abound. For example, the Gamelot, a monk of his time, argued, well, look here. It seems to me that you're saying that if I could think of an island that was the most perfect island in the whole universe, then it would have to exist, because the one thing that would be more perfect would be the most perfect island, and it existed. And it doesn't seem to be just because something's perfect it comes into existence. I'd object that the most perfect circle or triangle, or any other geometric shape for that matter, is one that exists only in our heads, or only as a matter of definition, that any exemplar geometric object is less perfect than the rendering we might make of it. And therefore, there isn't anything about existence that improves on perfection. St. Thomas objected to it. He said that in order to speak this way about God, you'd have to say that you understood what God's actual values, properties were, so that you could say that's the perfections to which God attains, and therefore that's the kind of perfection that has to exist. And he said we can't know God's abilities, his properties, because God is so much more than we can think of. And therefore, the argument from the idea of the most perfect being doesn't work out. Now, he rephrases this a little bit, Anselm rephrases this argument a little bit and says of God that God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. And in this case, he's trying to make sure that perfection is a necessary, that existence is a necessary quality of God. Because again, if we can conceive of something, then surely it's greater if it actually exists. Well, Gamelot's objections still maintain. My objections still maintain. Aquinas' objections still maintain. And let me propose yet another objection, one that sort of happened quite by accident. Some years ago when I was in graduate school, we had a secretary graduating. We had a secretary retiring. And as she retired, we had a party, and at the party, she was given a toast. Now, she was retiring after a little bout of illness, and she'd been out of the office for a while, and her replacement had already worked with us for a while, so we knew her pretty well. And when we toasted the retiring woman, I happened to be standing next to her replacement, and the gentleman who toasted the retiring woman said to Billy, that secretary than which no greater can be conceived. Just like we were saying, God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. The toast was, Billy was the secretary than which no greater can be conceived. And as I say, I'm standing to her next to her successor. She grew very stiff all at once. She was very uncomfortable. This made her unhappy. She thought she was doing a good job, that she was fitting into our community. And I turned to her and I said, just because no greater can be conceived doesn't mean that another can be just as great. Again, Anselm's arguments either achieve too much or too little. And either way, you either have him trying to create the necessity of existence out of perfection, too much, or it turns out it lets you propose more than one divinity, which is certainly more than he wanted to achieve in his work. So Anselm, not so much, not too impressed with Anselm. A little more impressive is St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he proposes basically 5 arguments, and they're given all kinds of names throughout the history of philosophy. I'm going to concentrate on the ones which are found in the article 5 Ways in Wikipedia. Okay? Okay. The first of the 5 ways is the one that's usually referred to as a cosmological argument. That is the argument from the unmoved mover. Motion has to start somewhere. Otherwise you have an infinite regress, and infinite regresses are meaningless. Peace on that. Perhaps they aren't, but it certainly appeared that way to medieval thinkers. And for most of us, I mean, let's be honest, we have a real difficult time thinking that it just goes back forever. I mean, certainly modern cosmogony suggests that it all begins with the Big Bang. So even science doesn't like to go back into an infinite regress if possible. So if there isn't an infinite regress, then there has to have been some first mover, some unmoved mover. And says St. Thomas, everyone agrees that that is God. Well, for what it's worth, that's a stolen argument. That is to say, the argument for the unmoved mover is a stolen argument. He steals it from Aristotle. And in Aristotle, he uses this argument to prove, as I remember, 37 unique unmoved movers. Certainly not the goal of some Christian thinker that he'd like to arrive at 37 gods. For Aristotle, a polytheist, no problem there. But for a Christian, a real problem, and Aristotle, Aquinas does not want to arrive there. He doesn't arrive there. And objection 1 we raise is the unmoved mover. Why not an infinite regress? We accept no infinite regress. We now have the possibility of more than one unmoved mover. As I say, Aristotle argues that more than one is necessary. And lastly, but not leastly, what sort of God is this unmoved mover? I mean, he's essentially a philosophical construct. And one of the problems all of these arguments for the existence of God have is that they tend to run into creating what is often called the philosopher's God. And the philosopher's God is an entity who may well meet logical necessity or fit into a philosophical construct, but seldom is like the divinity in any actual religious text or any actual worship service. The idea of an unmoved mover is precisely one where we have no effect on it. That's why it's unmoved. We tend to think that the whole purpose of religion is to move God or gods to help us in our state of life. Unmoved mover doesn't do that. Neither, for that matter, does the first cause. that's the next argument that Aquinas presents. He wants to say, we all agree, things can't have been, everything that exists has been caused by something. Since that's true, that must be caused, and everything must be caused, and we go back forever to the first cause, that cause which isn't caused by anything else but is its own cause, and that first cause is what all men mean by God. Again, no, nobody means that by God outside of a philosopher. But again, more to the point, we have the same question. How can we restrict it to just one first cause? There isn't any way to do that. That first cause could have been led up to a string of causes, led to a dead end, where its last cause was a new first cause, for lack of a better way of putting it. And we could have a whole chain of first causes, in other words, and it's just not a very useful tool in determining God. And again, the qualities that this God has, this first mover, prime mover, first cause, prime cause, that cause has no humanity about it whatsoever. Another thing is this. I mean, in modern cosmogony, again, we think of the Big Bang as a first cause, but the Big Bang does not continue to exist. The Big Bang, once having banged, has banged. That primal state of affairs has now passed on. There are no primal states of affairs like that. So why, again, would we say that the first cause continued to exist, and there's in the world, all those kinds of things that we were talking about last time when we talked about gods and what they were like? Not very like we have in mind at all. The argument from contingency. Now this is sneaky, so you got to stay with me on this, okay? Go real slow here. Aquinas argues that what does exist doesn't have to exist. In other words, that our reality as we live it is contingent. It's not necessary. That everything about, it's not necessary that I have hair, that the hair I have has this color, that hair grows on the top of my head. Just goes on and on. All these things that could be other than they are, and therefore don't have to be as they are. So all of these things are contingent. Now, a purely contingent universe, he says, makes no sense. And therefore, there has to be some entity which is necessity, which it must exist, which must be in the world, and that entity is what all men call God. Okay, we can see this is a lot better than the first cause, in that it has to continue to exist, this necessary being. It's the thing that underlies all of our contingencies. Well, no, it doesn't have to exist. There has to be some necessary being at any given moment in time, yes, if everything is contingent and all of their existence depends upon the necessary being. But you could have a series of necessary beings, you could have a group of necessary beings, any one of which is adequate to the existence of the contingent world as it is, or any combination maybe of necessary beings that define this particular reality. And then what's wrong with pure contingency? The whole doctrine of multiple universes is exactly the discovery that there's perfect mathematical consistency, at least, to saying every possible universe exists. Thus, there is no necessary being holding everything together. Everything is purely contingent. Everything could be different than it is. In fact, not only could it be, it is in fact different than it is in some parallel multiple universe state. So much for the argument from contingency. The argument from degree. Here the idea is that we say that things are not perfect. The world is not filled with perfect things. In order for us to be aware of that, there must be some perfect thing which we can compare everything against. And even the perfections of the perfect things have to be comparable to something which is pure perfection. Otherwise, again, we wouldn't know. You only know the degree of a thing based on your ability to compare it to some perfect state of affairs, that perfect being whose perfection is the perfection of perfection, that, he says, is God. Well, again, let's borrow what he said to Ansel. How will we know God is perfect? Because we don't even know what God's qualities are. Then we can say, why must the perfect thing be perfect? My suggestion in how to handle grading in class, that perfection is perfect given the circumstance we're in, given the location that we're in, given what we're doing in the world at this time. And thus, the idea of perfect perfection is not only not necessary, but in fact meaningless. So the argument from perfection seems to run into trouble too. Now, for a long time, the argument that was most popular from Aquinas' 5 Ways was the teleological argument. And that is to say that if you took a look at the universe, you would see that there is order in the universe. Everything seems to run in a particular pattern, in a particular way. And that particular pattern is, in fact, because there is a design to things. There is a designer. There is an order. And if there is an order, then we would have to say there's some designer. That is to say, if there's an end, a goal the universe is working toward, then it has to be someone whose goal it is. And the argument here is, well, that's God. However, certainly since the 19th century, teleological reasoning has fallen into great disrepute. We don't tend to argue, for example, in nature, that animals have this or that shape based on some goal for those animals, but rather this is a product of their having to fit into an environment, that the shapes of the continents aren't based on some plan for how the continents should look, but rather are the product of essentially chaotic continental drift, and as a result, this is how things are. One of the most important claims comes out of chaos theory, which is this idea, at minimum, I mean, chaos theory is a lot more complicated than I'm going to make it sound, but it is at minimum this idea that order emerges of a necessity from chaos. That although chaos, which is simply to say there is a state of affairs in which we cannot predict the necessary outcome of that state of affairs, nevertheless some state of affairs does emerge from it. And often we can even project back into the chaos to discover why this particular state of affairs emerged from it. But not always. I mean, a weather system, we don't know how a particular weather system came to be. We can't know. The number of variables are so many and so complicated that this kind of linear causality just simply isn't possible. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I can know where a subatomic particle is, or I can know the direction it's going in, but I can't know both, because what I need to know in order to know one makes it impossible for me to know the other. And these things are empirically confirmed. I mean, if you're into empirical confirmation, these things are all empirically confirmed. And so we've stopped talking about the design of clouds or storms or animals or continental shapes, and instead we talk about the results of a process of continental drift and erosion, evolution, of fitting into the environment, of ecological pressures, which all come and have results not because of the outcome desired, but rather because when you shuffle the deck, the cards all get messed up. And however they get messed up is the way they're messed up. And you can't know in advance, and nobody could know in advance, and there's no point in even bothering to think about in advance. Rather, what is important is to know what we have now, and we can mathematically go back perhaps and project where it all came from, but it's not knowable from the present toward the future. And if it's not, then teleological reasoning is weak, and if teleological reasoning is weak, there's no need to think that it works for God if it doesn't work for potato salad. And thus, the fifth way is abandoned. Again, there are philosophical thinkers who go, hurrah! That proving the existence of God would be a bad thing if we could. But the important thing for you is to see that, one, the attempt is made because people want certainty. Getting to certainty is not always easy, but they want certainty. Two, that there are no universally accepted successful attempts to prove the existence of God. Lots of attempts are the most successful patterns are the ontological, this idea that there has to be some best of all possible beings, and its nature is such that it must exist. Although, as I say, no one accepts any of these arguments for it. Most famously is Kant, who suggests that existence is not a quality of a thing. That you can talk about all the qualities of God that you like, but existence is not a quality. Existence either is or it isn't. It's something. It's not something that something has. If it exists, it exists, and that's all there is to it. You don't go around saying, well, here's $15, and I reach out my empty hand, here's $15 to give to you, and you go, I don't see any $15, and I say, oh, well, that's all the qualities of $15, it just doesn't exist. No. So existence is not a quality of things. Either exists or doesn't exist, says Kant. So, not a logical argument. The teleological argument, as I gave you a moment ago, and as I say, the chief reason it's rejected nowadays is because teleological reasoning as a whole is rejected nowadays. If we found some reason to accept it again, then we'd have to revisit Aquinas' position. Although, even still, I think it probably falls into the same general line of argument, opposition, that the other things do. And then the other most successful one is the cosmological argument, the idea that there is something, some being on which all of existence depends, either the first mover, the first cause, or the necessary being, that without this, the rest of existence wouldn't be here. Again, this idea that these things once get you both more and less than you really are looking for. It doesn't get you anywhere. I'll be interested if you want to propose any arguments of your own. Love to see them. I've looked up some other arguments and you'd like them critiqued. Love to critique them. But on the whole, proving the existence of God hasn't been very successful. I'll leave you with two stories. I believe it was Descartes, but it might have been Euler. I can never remember which. Came to visit some king or another, been appointed to court, and the king demanded that in order to establish himself as a worthwhile member of the court, that the mathematician prove the existence of God. And he stepped up to the blackboard and just went number after number and theorem after theorem, and then arrived at a conclusion. QED, God exists. And the king says, well, I can't follow that math. And the mathematician says, well, trust me, it proves that God exists. So that's the story. Ha ha ha, almost funny. And then, of course, there's the other side of the coin. The great mathematician and astronomer Pierre Laplace wrote a book on, the first real important book on the creation of the solar system, describing coalescence of solids out of gases and all those kinds of things that we're used to in a discussion of how stars come into existence, how planets come into existence, how their orbits get defined, all those kinds of things that we're very familiar with. And he gave it to Napoleon. And the story goes, Napoleon read the book and said, but Mr. Laplace, where's God in all of this? And Laplace is supposed to have looked at Napoleon and said, I have no need of that hypothesis. And this is, as I say, the danger of the philosopher's God, that he has no place in worship. There's also another God, the God of the gaps. And that's, I think, more what Laplace is talking about, that for a lot of people, God explains the unexplained parts of life. And as science fills in those gaps of knowledge of how we get from step A to step B in the creation of planets, the development of species, curing illnesses and things like that, the gaps get smaller and smaller, and all that's left is this little hole where God is invoked in order to paper over the gaps for persons who can't deal with the insecurity. Again, not much of a God. The gods that inspired the temples in Angkor Wat, the Sistine ceiling, the stories of Homer and the paintings in the pyramids, they're not so lame as the God of the gaps or the philosopher's God. They drive people to passion and creation. So these proofs, even if they work to prove something, I don't think have anything to do with real religion or people's real belief in God. All right. This is the last one I'm going to get posted before class tonight. There will be 2 more posted as the week goes by. And then I'll start posting for next week. As I recall, we have a quiz coming up real soon. I don't think this is divided into 3. I don't remember, I'll be honest with you. Why don't I take a quick look? So as I take a look, what I will be trying to do is to make sure that all the possible recordings we need in order to get where we're going will be here before you have to take a quiz on it. With the last quiz, because we were making the shift over and we were just getting to as I recall, just 2 sections to this. So I'll just go right along, and I'll keep putting out every day some further information. Everything that appears on the test will appear in this material. I will try to offer a little summary near the end, but I'm not going to hand out that nice sheet of answers that I've done for the last two quizzes. With this one, you're going to have to come back and hear this material again, or have read it in the book, or discussed it with one another in order to know what the answers to the test questions are. But this material will be available to you through the whole of your test. Okay? Okay. Don't panic. I hand out the grades. You have no idea what your grade is. You can look at everything in the handouts and you do not know, because I make the grades. You know what the worst possible grade is that you could get. You do not know what the best possible grade is. So relax about that. Okay? Listen to it again if you like. Take a few better notes. Have a good time.